Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this session that I'm really excited and pleased to be able to be hosting. This is my friend and colleague, someone I'm really proud to call my friend, the wonderful author Richard Zimler. Before I go any further, though, I'm going to give the land acknowledgement. Those of you who don't live in Canada, I think there are people coming here from several countries, including Portugal. We try and acknowledge the land that we are speaking from physically. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University, the university that's hosting this session, York University campuses are located. And these relationships and nations precede by many centuries, many centuries, the establishment of York University. We acknowledge the presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The nation known in English as Toronto, Toronto, has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It's now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We also acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish of One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So it's those of you, again, who are not Canadian, this is what we do in Canada for almost any public presentation for the past several years. Anyway, Richard is going to speak for himself. There's not much I can say about him. I'll just say that I think we've met each other first many years ago, perhaps 25 years ago, when I was starting my own research on hidden Jews and their music in Portugal. And I read the book, The Last Kabbalist of Lisbon, and fell in love with it completely. And then someone gave me Richard's contact, or I just looked him up. I can't remember Richard. And we became both colleagues and friends. And I can tell you that he's a wonderful author, a meticulous researcher with a professional background in journalism, a fantastic historian, a great conversationalist, wonderful companion, knows how to find the best coffee in Lisbon and Oporto. And I think I'm just going to let him talk for himself. He's written, of course, many books besides this Sephardic cycle, of which Incandescent Threads is the most recent, I did want to tell you. The Warsaw Anagrams on a different aspect of Holocaust Jewish history, and also several books that have to do with other themes, other human themes. And I've read, as far as I know, every one of them with interest and pleasure. And we're going to hear from David Kaufman, the interim chair of Judaic Studies at York, because he wasn't able to be with us today.
Hello and welcome, dear guest, Richard Zimler, dear host, Judith Cohen, and to all those joining from far and wide. My name is David Kaufman. I'm the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry. I'm an associate professor in the Department of History and the acting director of the Israel and Golda Kashitsky Center for Jewish Studies here at York University. I cannot be in two places at once, alas, but I wanted to be here virtually to offer a warm welcome on behalf of the Kashitsky Center to our guest, to our host, and of course our public for today. It's really an honor and privilege to be able to platform a discussion today with Mr. Zimler, author of The Last Kabbalist of Lisbon, The Gospel According to Lazarus, and Warsaw Anagrams, to discuss his latest work, which is entitled Incandescent Threads. Great title, by the way. Released, I think, just last week here in Canada by Parthian Books. So it's fresh off the press. This book is the latest in a fabulous and fascinating series referred to as the Sephardic cycle. I also offer my sincere appreciation to Professor Judith Cohen, a longtime teacher and contributor to York, its Faculty of Music, it's our Center for Jewish Studies, a musician and writer and educator and all-around talent. Thank you, Judith, for leading today's program and for bringing Richard's work further out into the world. I hope you have a wonderful discussion today, and I very much look forward to watching the video of it myself tomorrow.
Thank you so much, David. I know that you would have really enjoyed being here, and I'm saying you and not he, because I know that you're going to be watching this within 24 hours or fewer. So if you have questions, by the way, you're welcome. Some of you already have done this to put them in the Q&A, and we'll monitor them and make sure that as many as possible get addressed afterwards. And in the meantime, let's pass you right over to Richard Zimler.
Well, thank you so much for introducing me, Judith, and thanks to everyone at the Center for Jewish Studies at York University for the invitation and for organizing this session. As Judith said, we've been friends for quite some time. And what she may not know is she had some influence over the latest novel, The Incandescent Threads, because one of the main characters happens to be an ethnomusicologist and a great flute player, and she specializes in Sephardic music. And there's no one I know who represents that field of study better than Judith. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to the participants from different countries who are listening and who can ask questions. And as you know from the announcement about this talk, I'm going to be talking about speaking for the silenced. And I'd like to start talking about a moral issue that we tend to forget, but that's extremely important to me and been very important in my writing. And the moral issue is the right to exist. Now, I realize that may sound a bit strange, but until the 1960s or 1970s of the last century, almost all history books and school books were written from the point of view of the people who won all the battles, who won the wars, who were elected prime minister, who were elected presidents. There was an official history to all of our countries, whether that's the United States or Canada or Portugal or Spain or Peru or Brazil. And I live in Portugal and I've lived there for 32 years, so I tend to include examples from there. But today, because Canada is much closer to the USA, I want to use an example from America. And it's also in keeping with Judith's message about the First Nations and the original inhabitants of the area around Toronto and virtually all of Canada and the United States. So I'm going to choose the topic of the colonization of the United States. I grew up in New York, just outside New York City, and it was a territory for very important tribes like the Mohawk and the Iroquois. It started being settled by Europeans in the 17th century, first by the English and the French, later from Holland and from Germany and from many other countries. And for a time, these people lived peaceably with the Native Americans. But as we all know, things became much more bellicose and warlike after that. And how much time at school when I was growing up just outside New York did we spend talking about Native American history and Native Americans who lived in the New York area, their culture, their music, their religion? I suspect that we didn't spend more than 2, 3, 4 hours on any of these topics. The Native Americans for many decades were excised from the official histories of the United States, except of course for the terrible movies from John Ford and John Wayne, which all showed the Indians as the enemies and savage people. I suspect that my experience in American schools was the same, regardless of where you grew up. Now, without the right to exist, you simply vanish. What you lived, how you lived, what you thought about, how you passed your days, what your hopes were, what your desires and fears were, they all vanish. And so this becomes a moral issue. Do all living human beings have the right to exist? Because making someone completely invisible seems to me a crime against humanity. And so I discovered this aspect of our histories and our cultures through researching my first book, which Judith mentioned, The Last Kabbalist of Lisbon. So I want to talk a little bit about what that book taught me. The project started way back in 1989, Middle Ages for some of the younger participants on this webinar. And I was on vacation in New York visiting my parents, and my mother was a voracious reader. Our house was like a library. And in the room where she kept biographies and art books, I discovered a book on Jewish manuscript illumination. Now, I knew nothing about this tradition because although I grew up in a Jewish household, we were Jewish by culture. My parents were secular individuals. My father was something of a communist, very left-wing, in the tradition of many sons and daughters of Jewish immigrants to America and probably to Canada as well. My mom was a scientist, a biochemist. She loved to celebrate the Jewish holidays like Passover and Hanukkah, but we hardly ever went to synagogue. We only went there for a marriage or for a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah. So I discovered in this book, in her room, this book on Jewish manuscript illumination, which I knew nothing about, opened it, and I discovered this incredible tradition of artwork, of artists living throughout the Jewish diaspora. So in Germany, Italy, Poland, Portugal, Spain, Morocco, Yemen, who illustrated mostly, but not only, sacred literature. So they illuminated the Old Testament, the Haggadah, which tells the story of the Exodus, prayer books, etc. And some of the illustrations were even a bit odd and strange and aroused my curiosity. For instance, there were some of parrot-headed men and women, and I'd never heard anything about that tradition, about that mythology. And I noticed in the book that there'd been a school of illumination in Portugal prior to the start of the Inquisition. So we're talking about the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. I had already been to Lisbon to visit my father-in-law. So like in a comic book or a cartoon, this balloon opened on top of my head, this light bulb went off saying, I could write a novel about a Jewish manuscript illuminator living in Portugal in the 13th, 14th, or 15th century. And while I knew I would have to do an enormous amount of research because I knew nothing about daily life in Portugal in any of those centuries, what kind of foods people ate, what kind of clothing they wore, how they built their houses, how many people were there. The dominant religions, I assumed, was Catholicism or Christianity. How many Jews lived there? How many Islamic people? So I had to do an enormous amount of research. In fact, I ended up doing an entire year of research, accumulating a huge mountain of notes that I still have somewhere here in Porto. And along the way, I discovered two important things that influenced my writing. First was Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, and we can talk more about that later if you want. But the most relevant thing I learned that's specific to the Last Kabbalist of Lisbon was the Lisbon Massacre of 1506. In April of 1506, during secret Passover celebration, they were secret because the king of Portugal, King Manuel, had forcibly converted all the Jews in Portugal 9 years earlier, in 1497, creating a new class of citizens called New Christians. So during the secret Passover ceremonies of these New Christians, a riot broke out. We use the word pogrom. That's kind of a modern word from the Ashkenazi culture, but it was a riot, anti-Semitic, in which 2,000 New Christians, converted Jews, were taken from their homes, murdered, and burnt in the main square of Lisbon, which is called the Rocio. For those of you who've been to Lisbon, it's still the main square, the Rocio. And if you come, obviously you can see it. The riot broke out in front of one of the large churches there, St. Dominic's Church. And we can talk later about why this riot happened. But priests, Dominican friars, went throughout the city calling death to the Jews. And 2,000 of these New Christians were murdered. Now, when I found out about that, I asked all my friends in Portugal, so professors and lawyers and doctors and carpenters and other writers, what do you know about the Lisbon Massacre of 1506? And they all turned to me as if I was crazy and said, what massacre? What are you talking about? There was no massacre. And I slowly learned, and by doing more research, that this crime against humanity had been excised from Portuguese official history. It wasn't in official histories about Portugal. It wasn't in the school books. Only a handful of specialists knew anything about it, knew that it had occurred. Now, it happens that I have a very subversive personality. So when I find that other people would like to cover up a crime against humanity, to cover up a terrible, terrible tragedy, I become enthusiastic and I want to talk about that. I want them to force to recognize that these terrible crimes have occurred in all our countries, not just Portugal, obviously. And so I spent a year of my life researching it, 2 years writing it, 3 years of my life. And then I showed the book to my literary agent in New York who loved it. And he started sending it out to publishers one at a time because I wasn't well known. And after 2 years, 24 publishers had turned the book down. Terrible time for me. They all said it was a wonderful book, exciting, based on true events, incredibly dramatic, but it wouldn't sell. Because of those of you who know the United States, realize that Americans often have a geographical problem. We think that the world begins in Maine and Florida and ends in California and Hawaii. So Lisbon in 1506 was way off their radar. So I was very depressed. It was 5 years of my life, a year of research, 2 years of writing, and another 2 years waiting for everybody to reject the book. Now, one of these rejections even showed a little bit of anti-Semitism. The editor at this particular publishing house wrote that he'd already bought his Jew book for the year, meaning, of course, that he'd had a quota for Jewish books, and using Jew book, a terribly disparaging way of referring to Jewish people. Anyway, all this left me extremely depressed. I thought, well, I'm never going to become a writer. I've written the best book I can. It's not perfect, but no novel ever is, no work of art ever is. So, but I had a crazy idea, which is proof that crazy ideas sometimes save you. The book takes place in Portugal. Presumably the characters are speaking Portuguese, even though I wrote it in English. And so I decided to show it to a Portuguese publisher. I knew nothing about the world of literature here. I didn't know the names of any of the editors or publishers. I asked two people I know for lists of names, and the name in common was Maria de Piedade Ferreira. So I contacted her. At the time, she was running a small, high-quality publishing house called Quetzal. So I spoke to her in my pidgin Portuguese. My Portuguese was terrible because I never studied the language, although now I'm fluent. And she said, okay, send me the book. So I sent it to the manuscript, written in English. And a month went by, 2 months went by, 3 months went by. I thought, well, she didn't like it. So I called her up and she said, come to Lisbon. Now I moved to Porto, which is 200 miles north. I've been living here ever since. And so I took the train down, expecting her to say, very dramatic, based on true events, wonderful characters, but it's not going to sell. Instead, the first thing she told me was, what would you like to see on the cover? Now, my Portuguese, as I say, was very rudimentary, so I thought maybe I didn't understand. So I asked her, does that mean you want to publish the book? And she said, yes, we loved it. Of course we want to publish it. And do you have an idea for an image or for the cover? I don't remember anything else about what we talked about because I was up in my seventh heaven because the book was finally going to come out. And it was published. First, we had to get the translation by Jose Lima, wonderful translation. And it came out in April of 1996. And Maria Piedade warned me, you've written about a part of unofficial Portuguese history. You've spoken for people who were forcibly silenced, the new Christians of Lisbon and Portugal. You've given voice to them. So maybe no one's going to buy your book because this all shames and embarrasses us, what you've written about. Exactly the opposite happened. I think I got lucky. I wrote the book at a time after 300 years of Inquisition and nearly 50 years of dictatorship, when people in Portugal for the first time were able to talk about Jewish history, about maybe having Jewish ancestors in their own family. And so the book became a #1 bestseller here. And it's thanks to the success in Portugal that my literary agents in Europe were later able to find wonderful publishers in Germany and Italy and Brazil, and finally in the United States and England. So the book has been translated now into 23 languages. It's a miracle for me. But more than the success of the book, I wanted to talk about what it taught me, which is that I love to write about people. It gives me great satisfaction, who've been forcibly silenced, whose voices have disappeared. And I've done this in subsequent novels. In Guardian of the Dawn, for instance, we'll have a re-edition next year from my new publisher. It's about how the Portuguese exported its Inquisition, this terrible, terrible persecuting force branch of the church, how they exported it to Goa, which was a Portuguese colony in India, and how for 3 centuries they persecuted that Hindus who were forced to convert to Catholicism, and the small Jewish community forced to convert to Christianity. And they were kept in prisons and tortured and burnt in acts of faith, autos de fe, all the way up to the beginning of the 19th century. After I published this book, I got some hate mail. It's the only time I've gotten hate mail from people in Goa in Portugal, because I discovered that, like these very sick people who negate the existence of the Holocaust, who deny that there were camps and extermination of Jews and Roma, there are very sick people in Goa and elsewhere who deny that the Inquisition persecuted Hindus and Jews all the way from 1560 to the beginning of the 19th century. So they sent me hate mail, which was very disturbing, but I suppose it was the proof that my books are having an effect, the desired effect. I wrote The Seventh Gate, about a part of the Holocaust that a lot of people would even today prefer to forget, the Nazi war on disabled people. I think that being disabled may be the last taboo. You know, we're allowed to talk about LGBTQ people. We're allowed to talk about, you know, all sorts of minorities, and Native Americans for the first time in a very long time are becoming part of our histories. But disabled people, I discovered when the book came out in Sweden that no newspapers or magazines would give it any coverage, because all the way through the 1960s in Sweden, they were sterilizing women whom they considered unhygienic, who were considered not good enough for Swedish, for reproducing and having kids. And so it was great researching this topic, and it's I think a wonderful novel about that aspect of the Holocaust. I've written Hunting Midnight, which has to do with the Jews of Portugal being able to come out of the closet for the first time and practice their religion. So the Inquisition has just ended, and the Jewish communities in Lisbon and Porto elsewhere are just finding the courage to finally begin to express their religious beliefs in public. It's a difficult time for them. It's also about a people in Southern Africa, the Bushmen, the San, who have been decimated, have lost a great deal of population in their culture. And it turns out that, genetically speaking, historically speaking, they may be the first people on Earth. They're our ancestors, no matter who we are. And when I discovered that their mythology was disappearing, their ancient stories, I realized I had to write a book about them as well. So this book mixes, it's a very ambitious novel that mixes the culture of the San with the Sephardic Jews of Portugal. And later, the narrator, John Zarco, takes a trip to the southern part of the United States, and the book deals with slavery. And in the latest novel, which Judith has mentioned, is called The Incandescent Threads. And I want to talk a little bit about the incandescent threads and what it's about. And then I want to turn it over to the participants and Judith, and maybe have some questions and answers. So the story of the incandescent threads goes back 45 years to when I was a little kid living in the New York suburbs. I was 12 years old, and I read Anne Frank's diary for the first time, and I found it very disturbing. And when I closed the novel, I felt as if I was betraying her. Maybe some of you have had that experience, because I didn't want her to go to Bergen-Belsen. I wanted somehow to save her. I was only 12 years old. And I grew up in a neighborhood that was half Jewish. So those of you who have the same experience may recall that we grew up with neighbors who survived the Holocaust. They had Nazi tattoos on their arms. And the neighbors living right across the street, the Goldbergs, were from Budapest, Simon and Helen, and they had tattoos, and I knew from my mom what that meant. So after I read Anne Frank's diary, I found the courage somehow, I don't know how, to run outside to Simon Goldberg when he was washing his car and ask him if he had known Anne Frank or been in the camps with her. Kind of a crazy question, but I was a kid. And he smiled in this strange way. It was a smile that wasn't really a smile. It was like covering up all he didn't want to say, and said, it's a nice day. I'm washing my car. I can't talk about all those things. And the next day I spoke to one of his sons, David, who was a friend of mine, and I asked him what his dad had told him about the camps. And David said, nothing, because Dad says, my friend told me, that we're safe here now in America. There's no reason to talk about those things. And that seemed reasonable to me. And it was only years later, when I was already an adult, that I thought, well, maybe if you had suffered it in a camp or in a ghetto, maybe you would want your kids to know a little bit about what happened to you. Now, of course, I don't mean to imply any guilt. If you're a survivor of a concentration camp, a death camp, a ghetto, you have every right to deal with that trauma any way you see fit. So you can keep it in silence or talk about it all the time. I make no judgments. But I know from children of Holocaust survivors that this huge silence around the topic sometimes created a second trauma for them, for their generation. Because I remember my friend Julie from college telling me that the silence with which her father dealt with his experiences, the death of his parents, the deaths of his grandparents, the silence meant to her that maybe he didn't trust her enough to talk about it. And so that was very difficult for her. So I decided to write a novel about these two wonderful, charismatic, eccentric cousins, Benny and Shelley Zarko, who grew up in Warsaw. And they become the only survivors of the Holocaust in their family. But I didn't want to write about the death camps. I always recommend the novels of, the writings of Primo Levi. I think there's nothing more I could say about the death camps than what Primo Levi hasn't already written in a much better, much more complete, much more beautiful way. But I wanted to write about Benny and Shelley after World War II, how they remake their lives, how they get married, how they have children, and how they decide to deal with this huge trauma in their lives. And Benny and Shelley are both very different, although they're completely devoted to each other. Benny becomes a tailor in New York, and his way of dealing with this huge amount of suffering and his guilt at surviving, survivor's guilt, because he doesn't understand why he survived when his parents and grandparents didn't. His way of dealing it is not to talk about it, except when he's really pressed or really, really stressed out. In fact, in public, he never shows much affection for his son, Ethan, because he's worried that if he shows this, all his caring for this beautiful boy, that somehow Ethan will be taken from him. And so that's Benny's way of dealing with it. And because of all his guilt, he begins to look through books of Jewish mysticism, for books about the Kabbalah, for why he was permitted to survive. Shelley takes a different turn. Shelley decides that he's going to live every day to the fullest. He's extremely sexual. He's bisexual, exuberantly active with both men and women, which becomes a problem when he gets married to Julie, his wife, who's the daughter of Canadian Quakers. And at some point in the book, later in the book, she has to read him the riot act, as we say in America. She has to tell him, it's me or these other people. You can't keep sleeping around. You have to choose. Happily, I think Shelley makes the right choice. So it's about these two very different cousins and how they remake their lives. Now, in the first chapter, I wanted to discuss a second trauma in Benny's life when his wife, Ethan's mother, Teresa, this wonderful flute player and ethnomusicologist, when she dies. And Benny can't seem to go on with his life. He doesn't take in the mail. He doesn't answer phone calls except from Ethan. He gets all his food delivered. And the mailman, maybe you say postman in Canada, and a neighbor alert Ethan, he's up in Boston, to his father having isolated himself. So Ethan drives down from Boston to New York to help his dad. and he's able to do so. And it's a very emotional chapter about their relationship and Benny's past and Ethan's mom, Benny's beloved wife, Teresa. And when I ended the chapter, a strange thing happened to me. I realized I had nothing more to say about this period in Benny's life. So how was I going to go on with the novel? And this takes place around 2015 to 2018. So how was I going to go on with the book? Well, happily, Ethan, in his narrative of this first chapter, mentions Shelley, Benny's older cousin, mentions Julie, Shelley's wife, mentions, of course, his wonderful mother, mentions George, their Navajo best friend, who helps Shelley track down Benny back in Poland after the war. So he mentions all these glorious, wonderful, mysterious people. So I realized I wanted to write the rest of the novel from their point of view. So the novel became a kind of mosaic. There's 6 long chapters. 2 are written by Ethan, Benny's son. There's a chapter from Teresa, Benny's wife, this ethnomusicologist, a chapter from Julie, Shelley's wife, the nurse and Quaker, a chapter from George, who's half Navajo, half Jewish, on how he helps track down Benny after the war, and a chapter from Eva, a Christian Polish music teacher, a piano teacher, wonderful woman who hides Benny in her home during World War II and saves his life. And so the book took on this unusual structure. And so each reader has to kind of fill in the blanks and put the story together to discover the profound and wonderful and sometimes difficult and complex effect of these 2 cousins on all the people around them. Now, to finish, I just want to read one very brief excerpt from the book. This is in the chapter narrated by Eva, the Polish piano teacher, Christian, who saves Benny during World War II. And it's about a revelation that she has afterward. And she's writing now about a neighbor, Felix, who may have denounced them during World War II, and this revelation that she has. 6 months after our return, I crossed paths with Felix for the first time at the main market in Brzeźny. Curiously, I wasn't tempted to question him about what he'd done, because I'd learned by then that the Poles who'd collaborated with the Nazis all found good and noble reasons to betray the Jews and those of us who had hidden them. Just as the Poles who stood by while their Jewish neighbors were arrested, put in ghettos, and turned to ash, had found any number of justifications for their silence. But if an old student of mine had not brought me Benny, and if I had refused to take him in, then I too would have likely been guilty of the same unforgivable crime. The boy saved my life in that sense and permitted me to go on composing and teaching little children how to play Mozart and Beethoven. Though I realized soon enough, seeing clearly where duplicity and silence had brought my country, that I ought to have done much more to fight the Nazis from the very start. So Eva has this revelation that was a revelation for me as well, that she couldn't have gone on with her life had she not worked actively against the Nazis and saved Benny. So in that sense, little Benny, 11 years old, this wonderful little Jewish boy, saved her life as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Richard. I don't know how you said so many things, each one of which needs to be thought about in so little time. Now I feel like I have to go back and read the novel a 3rd time. I read it in the summer when I got it, and then I read it again, of course, before this this occasion. And now I think, oh no, I better go back and read it again and find that point where you decided you had to write it from a different viewpoint.
Right.
I know there's a couple of other authors among the participants, and I think it's, amazing for all of us to have this insight, which I'm sure the other authors here will recognize more than I. I'm just an academic author. This insight into if I understood you well, how the book took on a life of its own and the characters took on a life of their own. And you didn't say to yourself, oh, I think I'll write the rest of it as a mosaic of chapters. What you said
Right.
to us was, and I realized that, that the story couldn't go on any further in this voice and that it had to be, done in another way. And that's such an insight. I was wondering when you wrote, first, The Last Kabbalist of Lisbon, and also when you wrote the Warsaw Anagrams and the Seventh Gate, did you have any idea that you were going to connect the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi, the Portuguese Sephardi history and experience this way? Was this a kind of master plan, or did it develop along the way?
Well, thank you, Judith, for all your kind remarks. As you know, the characters take over the books themselves and lead the novelists around. So I have to pay very close attention to Benny and Shelley and to Julie and Teresa and what they needed to say about these two wonderful cousins. No, there's no master plan. For better or for worse, I have no strategy for my career. Maybe it would be better if I did. But each book is has its own destiny, its own path, and seems to almost be a story that already exists, that's working its way out into the world through me. I know that may sound kind of new age and kooky, but when the writing is going really well, it feels as if you're in a trance, you're being possessed by these characters and their stories that absolutely need to be told, and that you're the only one who can tell them. Imagine if you were the only person in the world who could write the Moonlight Sonata, or who could write Jesus, Joy of Man's Desiring. The world is working through Bach and Beethoven, all the great composers. And maybe they felt that way too. I don't know. I've never read their biographies, but that's the way it feels to me. In terms of mixing the Ashkenazi and Sephardic world, one thing that historians have taught us, and Judith, you may have something to say about this in relation to the music that you've collected and sing. The historians have taught us, and genealogists have taught us, and now with genetic studies, we used to believe that the Sephardic and Ashkenazi worlds were extremely far apart. And we've discovered that wasn't always the case, that there were Sephardic people who, after being kicked out of Spain and after being converted and persecuted in Portugal, made their way eventually all the way to Hamburg, for instance, even to Warsaw, probably to Krakow. I haven't done research on Krakow, but they went to Salonika, they went to Istanbul, and where they went from there, they may have even gone into parts of the world that are now the Soviet, now Russia. I don't know. But these two worlds are not nearly as separate as we think. So in my book, Benny and Shelley have both an Ashkenazi and a Sephardic background. They speak Yiddish and they speak some Ladino as well through their great grandmother, Rosa. And that was a wonderful experience for me while writing the book, because I got to speak. I'm from the Yiddish culture. I'm from Ashkenazi culture. So for me, the discovery of the Sephardic world was one of the great discoveries of my life, because Ashkenazi people in general, at least of my tradition, my generation, knew nothing about the Sephardic world. So I feel it's something that I can bring to the Jews of New York and Montreal and Toronto, who are predominantly Ashkenazi. I can help bring this incredibly dynamic, dramatic, beautiful culture of the Sephardim to them. And I think that's something you've done with your music as well.
Well, I've tried, and like you, I'm Ashkenazi. We're actually from a very similar background, as you know, family background. I'm also from Montreal, so reading the bits, about Montreal and specific landmarks of Montreal was an extra treat. But in what you were saying about it, it's almost as if your incandescent threads also connected your books in ways that perhaps you only realized afterwards. And I have to say, I love this whole image of these incandescent threads, because there are so many unexplained connections in my life, and
Yeah.
just selfishly, it's one of the most beautiful ways of accounting for them I can think of.
Well, I look at it this way. Um, you know, who could have predicted that I would be in touch with you in Toronto, an ethnomusicologist and singer, and through you to the people you know in Morocco, from whom you've collected songs, and that you would be connected to me and my suburb in New York. And when I was 12 years old, having read Anne Frank, that we'd both be connected to Anne Frank, this adolescent hiding in her attic in Amsterdam. There are these incredible connections that exist for all of us. And that's what Betty means when he talks about the incandescent threads. I got criticized in a review in the Jewish Chronicle in England, because he wrote that he was very positive about the book and saying this may become a Jewish classic. But on the other hand, maybe the stuff about incandescent threads, is the word he used was hokum, maybe craziness. And that offended me because, well, first of all, he confused me with Benny. I'm not Benny. Benny is the one who's, comes up with this theory about incandescent threads. That's an amateur mistake to confuse the author with the characters. It's like people who think that Shakespeare was a Danish prince named Hamlet. No, he wasn't. Hamlet is separate from Shakespeare, and not everything Hamlet says is what Shakespeare believes. And I don't mean to compare myself with Shakespeare, but I just wanted to make that clear. But I got offended because who are we to say to a Holocaust survivor how he or she should remake their lives and find meaning? Who am I to determine for Benny how he resolves the problem of his survivor's guilt? And if he needs to look in Kabbalah and he believes in the incandescent threads, which I do believe in, then who am I to call that hokum? Isn't that incredibly pretentious and presumptuous and even hostile? So, I don't know this reviewer, and it's fine that he said these things, but I was offended for Benny.
Which brings back the whole idea of how your characters take on a life of their own, even though you're not Benny.
I'm not Benny, but I had to defend him.
Absolutely. I'm going to look at a couple of the Q&As here and see what people want to comment or ask. And I'm going to actually put my glasses on and
Okay.
get used to do that. So we first have an introduction from Professor Asher J. Matatias, who by his last name, I assume, is from Salonika. And he says, by way of introduction, I'm a Greek American Jewish Holocaust survivor. And he gives a couple of links. So I would really love to talk to you, Professor Matatias. And if you have a specific question for Richard, I'm sure he'll be really honored to.
I just want to mention that one of the characters in the novel, Maury, is a Greek Jew, a Sephardic Jew from Salonika.
Yeah.
And his daughter is Teresa, who marries Benny. So, and Maury's great. Maury's fabulous.
Yeah, he's a great character. I enjoyed him a lot. I've met many Jews from Salonika, including in Salonika, over the years. So, Professor Matatias, if you're still with us and you want to ask a question, make a comment, or do you want me to share your link? Let me know in the Q&A if you want me to share your link in the chat. Abe Masliach, which is another classic surname, says that he visited Oporto last May. He said, and I loved it. My son is working on his Portugal citizenship, as my father, that is his grandfather, was Sephardic from Salonika. He said, I'm 76. Is there any reason for me to seek Portugal citizenship? And what do you love about Porto besides port? And I assume by port, he means the drink and not the place.
Yeah, I think so.
And I'm going to jump in and say, Abe, if I were Sephardic and I could get Spanish or Portuguese citizenship, I would have had it by now very, very happily. And I am not far away from 76, but I'll let Richard answer.
I mean, again, I think it depends on your emotional connection to Portugal, to the Portuguese language, to the country. If you feel a spiritual and psychological connection to Portugal, however that manifests itself in your life, I think maybe you could try to get citizenship, because maybe that's important to you in some way. Of course, it has practical considerations. If you have a Portuguese passport, you can travel around Europe very easily, work in Europe freely. And so I know a lot of people in both camps, both who I've met British people, for instance, who feel this very strong emotional connection to Portugal because their ancestors went from here, where I am now in Portugal, to London, for instance, and became part of the Bevis Marks, this very well-known synagogue in London. And so they want citizenship because they've always felt Portuguese. Um, uh, Unfortunately, the program for nationality has been put on pretty much on hold, I believe, because there have been some scandals here about frauds being committed, about people getting citizenship who really do not have a Portuguese Jewish background. I don't know where that stands right now, but it may be very, very difficult for you to get citizenship that way. You'll have to probably ask at an embassy or consulate what the situation is now. If you have trouble getting information that way and need to contact me, please do so through my website, which is Zimler.com. You can contact me very easily, and I will try to get more information from you. But it may be very difficult at this point. Now, why Porto? Why I like living here? I mean, I'm a reader of mine wrote me just before going online today to say, please be sure to tell everyone in Canada that we love you here, that we consider you a Portuguese writer, and that you are one of our favorite people. So, I mean, I have such a boost from living in Porto and Portugal. Every day when I go out in the street, people thank me for the books. People shout at me from their cars while driving. I love your books. I get so much support here from my readers. It's just, I'm having a bad day during the pandemic. We're all a bit stressed out. And I go outside and someone comes up to me and says, thank you for the incandescent threads, or thank you for the Last Kabbalist of Lisbon. It changed my life. It doesn't get any better than that. So that's why one of the reasons I love living here. Also, we all know the world has gone a bit mad with conspiracy theories and ignorance and racism and homophobia in the United States, in Poland, in Hungary, and many other places. And Portugal, for me, is a refuge. We have a very good prime minister. We have a very progressive government who wants to fight climate change, who's taking active measures to do so. And so I feel very proud to be able to contribute to this country and make and reinforce its democracy, because I think we've all learned through the United States and Brazil that we every day have to fight to make our democracies more inclusive, more open, and fight every day to make our histories. I talked about that in my talk. We have to, just put everyone in our official histories, not exclude people because they're a minority or because we don't happen to like their color of their skin, or the fact that they've transitioned, whatever it is. Everyone should be part of our history, and Portugal is doing that. We've come a huge long way. We have a distance to go, but I love living here, and it's not as cold as Toronto, so that helps too.
So I'm just going to add, as far as I know, I think the applications through the Oporto community are closed, at least
Yeah.
right now. But I believe they are still operating fine through Lisbon,
Okay.
as far as I know. So if you're going to apply, you would need to do it through Lisbon directly. And Belmont, I believe, was closed down ages ago because there
Yeah.
were things going on there that just, well, they weren't authorized. But Lisbon, as far as I know, is still working. And
Okay.
just to add a completely non-historical and non-political dimension, I love Oporto. It's a quirky city. It's full of tourists now. I can't believe
Yeah.
how much English and French and German that one hears in the streets, which never used to be the case. On the other hand, it's a lot easier to get around than it used to be. The metros
Yeah.
work perfectly. Um, all the connection streets that used to be kind of semi-closed off and difficult to walk up or down are
Absolutely.
open, but it hasn't been wrecked. It's actually one of the few cities I know that's brought itself up to date without wrecking its character. So I'm
Right.
just there this summer. So I missed Richard there and in Lisbon.
Yeah.
So I managed to
No,
miss it.
Porto's a wonderful city to visit. It's smaller than Lisbon, so you can walk around the historic center pretty easily if you're a little bit active, because there are hills.
Yeah, you have to walk up
Um,
and down a lot.
it's become much more international, as Judith has said, and that has both really great implications and not so great implications. like many cities in Europe, these bed and breakfasts have taken over, so it's hard to get rentals.
And it's also
And
become very expensive for people who are from there to live there, if they're
right,
already
the
hooligans. Yeah.
we still live in a very relatively poor country by European and American standards. So, the French who come here and the Dutch, they can live like kings in Portugal. Whereas for us, it can be a bit difficult. But come visit Porto if you've never been, and even if you have been, come back.
So I want to give you a comment from my friend and colleague here in Canada, Irene Marcus. Remember, I mentioned there were at least a couple of authors among us today. One is Irene Marcus, who's a wonderful writer. Irene, I think I've read all your books. I mean, maybe I haven't managed, but I think I've done it. And
Yeah.
Hilda Januario, who is coming out with a book on the Divino Espírito Santo in Canada in a couple of weeks. And Irene writes, the fact that your first book was rejected in the US first and so many times and then accepted in Portugal is interesting. I would say, and this is Irina saying, that the opposite tends to happen as Portuguese publishers seem to give more attention to writers who have published outside the country, especially the USA, the US being perceived as a desired market for world writers. But as you note, she says, maybe it was the right time in Portugal to speak about the Jewish question and the Inquisition in Portugal after so many years of silence and erasure.
Well, thank you, Irene. I think you're right. Also, the market has changed quite a bit. When I first came to Portugal to visit in 1980, and then in 1990 when I moved, the bestseller list included a lot of local authors, included some very, very high quality novelists from other countries. And now it's become much more uniform, like the bestseller list in Britain or in America. The same kinds of authors, the same kinds of terrible, terrible novels become bestsellers here. The market has become much more commercial. So yes, they are looking for American bestsellers, whether that's celebrity biographies, autobiographies, or how-to books, or, Stephen King or Danielle Steele. And so if you write original, high quality, moving fiction, it can be hard to be published anywhere these days, I find. And if you can prove that you have great sales in America or Britain, obviously it helps in Portugal. And it's all just extremely commercial now. And I think you're right. I got lucky. My book hit at the right time. And Maria de Piedad Ferreira, my publisher, took a chance on me. If she hadn't risked, taken a risk, maybe that book would have been published 5 years later or never, or my career would be totally different. So she refers to herself as the godmother of my career, and I think that's right.
We should all thank her.
I
And
do thank her all the time.
so Professor Matatias has a couple more things to say here. I'm going to see if I can collect them all.
Okay.
He said there's remarkably still lacking of appreciation of Greco-Jewish loss in the Holocaust, and this is absolutely true. I don't know how many times I've told people that I think 96 or 97% of the Jewish community of Salonika perished in the Holocaust. And the assistance of collaborators and enablers and anti-Semitic episodes today in today's Greece or Elas, cemeteries, Holocaust memorial synagogues attacked. Greece, he reminds us, was the sole European Christian nation to vote against the birth of a Jewish state, practically on this day in 1947, November 29th. And the Orthodox Church still preaches the crucifixion's blame to be centered on Jews. And then he later on says, thank you very much. I found people very friendly. I think that's in Portugal. But Professor Matatias has two more things to say, right? And let's not forget the jewel that is a UN secretary, right? Secretary General Antonio Guterres is from Fundão, Portugal. And Fundão is just about an hour and a half, or less actually, about an hour south driving from Belmonte, from the fabled town of Belmonte. And when I was last in Fundão, which was right after Secretary General Guterres took the position, I asked people in Fundão whether he was from the old Jewish neighborhoods. And they said, no, he wasn't. He was actually from another neighborhood entirely of Fundão. But since he did spend summers there most of his life, he's got to know all about the history of the Jews and the hidden Jews and the crypto Jews and practicing hidden Jews in Portugal because it was a really essential part of the town he grew up in. And by the way, speaking of Secretary Generals, the head of UNESCO is also Sephardic, but is Sephardic. Guterres isn't Sephardic, but she is Moroccan Sephardic. And her father is actually one of the main counselors of the King of Morocco. So
Wow.
Andrea Zulay, who is in his early 80s and is a wonderful, brilliant man, is one of the main counselors of the King of Morocco. And his daughter, Audrey Zulay, is the head of the director of UNESCO. So you might want to remember all that. We have a couple more things.
Let me just mention one thing to the professor, which is I talk about Salonika occasionally, or usually actually, when I talk about the Holocaust at schools, and I do a lot of talks in schools, and because I think Salonika happens to be one of the most tragic episodes in the last centuries with regard to the Holocaust and other crimes against humanity. Because imagine this: the Jews of Spain and Portugal, they managed to get out. They managed to flee the Inquisition, to reestablish themselves in a faraway country in Salonika, which was once part of the Ottoman Empire. And so they live their lives here. They become merchants and shoemakers and saddle makers and everything else. And they keep their language and they keep their customs and they celebrate the holidays in the traditional ways. And then the Nazis come along and occupy Greece, and they're virtually all killed. So they survived the Inquisition and all this persecution only to be liquidated, to be exterminated by the Nazis. I mean, it just seems just like the most tragic episode I can possibly imagine. And that Greece continues to be anti-Semitic to me, I find absolutely unbelievable and hard to stomach. I also want to mention that I just got back from Castelo Branco, which is not far from Fundão. And we went to the center for the remembrance of the Jewish community of Castelo Branco. And there was once a very thriving community there, including their very famous doctor and researcher, Amato Lusitano, and who ended up in Salonika fighting the plague. And I just wanted to mention they've done something wonderful there, which I think all the towns in Portugal should do, and maybe in Greece as well. It would be good to do this. They have a huge metal plaque, beautifully done, with all the names, every last name of the people persecuted by the Inquisition. They're all there. And when kids come in there, when adults come in there, they see the names. They know that Antonio de Oliveira, that Maria Sotomayor, that Isaac Costa. These were people who in some cases were burnt at the stake by the Inquisition. And I think that's really important for the people of Castelo Branco and other cities to know that these were their neighbors. These were people who lived in their houses where they're living now and who were destroyed by this religious intolerance.
Right. Thanks for that, Richard. And also on a positive note of what the Jews of Salonika has given us, many of you probably know, but maybe you've forgotten that the Pfizer vaccine against COVID, the head of Pfizer is actually a son of Jewish survivors of the Holocaust from Salonika, Burla. And he was, in fact, honored by the American Sephardi Federation last year. We have a couple of other questions here that I'd like to go to. Linda Davidson, this is very, very interesting. She tells us, I mean, everything's interesting, but she has a connection here. Her late grandfather's brother was Paul Goodman, secretary of the Bevismark Synagogue, and he wasn't himself Sephardic. She heard from her grandfather that he visited Porto, which, yes, Linda, he did, and may have written a Haggadah for the Porto community when he visited there. He was also secretary to Chaim Weizmann of the British Zionist Organization. There's a lot of documents, right, Richard, that are that have been taken out in the Library of Oporto in the archive and reordered and kind of cleaned up. I remember that from last time I was there. So I'm not sure if any of Paul Goodman's material is there, but it shouldn't be difficult to find out, Linda. Please let me know if you find this out. Linda, feel free to contact both me and Richard about this. We can follow up. And Linda also says, Toda Rabah for your amazing presentation. I just
Thank
learned
you.
from heritage that I myself have about 5% Sephardi and North African origin, going back to fourth generation grandparents. And she gives her email here, which I'll note. I'll be getting your books. As a former Jewish history teacher, I know that so little of non-Ashkenazi history is taught. Shalom and stay safe.
Thank you so much.
And another, Natalia Costa Roberts. Costa is, of course, a name that many of the hidden Jews in Portugal took or had. She says, can you talk about how or whether Jewish history or presence is written about, addressed by Portuguese authors? So yes, I'm sure you can talk about that from now
Well, a little bit.
next
I'm
year.
not an expert in Portuguese literature, but there only some younger authors are starting to write about the Jewish presence in Portugal now. But when I first came to Portugal back in 1980 and 1990, when I started researching my book, there was virtually nothing. I'm sorry to have to say this, nothing from a historical perspective or from a fictional perspective written about the great, fantastic, wonderful Jewish heritage of Portugal. There was one book that I recall about Portuguese Jewish history, not very well. It was a decent book, but it didn't have the details that someone like that I need when I write a novel, because I need very specific details and an analysis of how the Jews lived, where they lived. In terms of fiction, I know there's one short story by Miguel Torga, who's a very well-known writer here, about a tradition that supposedly existed in Portugal. No, it didn't.
No, no, that was, you're talking, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I have to say before you talk about the abafadores, that
Yeah.
was completely demystified by the great scholar David Gitlitz in his book. I
Okay.
can even tell you the exact page.
Okay.
So,
Well,
I
then
mean, the sad thing was that
it's a
Miguel Torga, who was a wonderful writer,
yeah,
perpetuated that very
but he
myth.
made that up.
Well, no, he didn't make it up. It was a myth, and he perpetuated it.
So okay, we have a lot of myths in
It was a local
Portugal.
legend. Yeah.
Yeah, I should talk. That's a story about someone who there about this myth of secret Jews, new Christians who wanted to be smothered before being read the last rites by a Catholic priest, which apparently is not true. There's many myths like that that aren't true in Portugal. Another one is that the Jews who were forcibly converted took on the names of plants and trees and flowers. This is completely false. I've done studies about this. They took on the most common Portuguese names. Judith mentioned Costa. The most common Portuguese name, for instance, in Belmont, among the new Christians, was Rodrigues. Rodrigues and then Lopes.
And Vaj, yeah.
Yeah. So that idea that they took on the names of plants and trees, completely false. It's also completely false that all the Jews were wealthy. You get this crazy anti-Semitic notion that all the Jews living in Portugal were doctors, and were an elite. What was the most common profession of Jews living in Belmont and that area of Portugal, the interior of the country, back in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century? New Christians. The most common profession was shoemaker. Not exactly the profession you want if you want to become a wealthy, well-known person. Jews had every profession in Portugal. They were shoemakers and saddle makers and vintners and carpenters and plumbers and everything else. In Lisbon, there was an elite, but that was because it was the capital of the country. In the rest of the country, in the villages and towns, they had every other profession, just like their Christian Catholic neighbors.
Okay, so a couple of questions here about books. Wait a second. So first, also Professor Matatias, obviously we should be in touch, says he's president of the Five Towns Lodge of B'nai B'rith in Long Island, which answers the question I was going to ask him about where he lives. And he gives his email, please contact him, or I can write it down for you, to tell them about your books, which is
Great.
well, thank you so much.
I grew up very close to where the professor lives because I grew up on the North Shore of Long Island. So in about half hour, I could be exactly where his his synagogue is. So I will write to you and thank you for any help that you can give me in the books.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Matatias. Irene Marques also talks about Ana Cristina Silva, who's written about the Jewish question in Portugal.
That's true. Yeah, I know Anna Christinas is a friend of mine. She's a very good writer. Um, yeah, I would definitely recommend her books. I don't know if they've come out in English yet, but if those of you who can read Portuguese, obviously she's someone you could look into.
Um, the book I mentioned, there's a question, Sharon Singer, you asked. Irene says she's a Rodriguez also. Sharon said, the book I mentioned is by David Gitlitz,
Yeah,
Gitlitz for Canadians and Z for Americans.
right,
He passed away actually just about a year and a half ago. He was living in Mexico and he had a number of really serious health conditions, and COVID caught up with him. I was at his Zoom memorial actually. So his book, well, he's written innumerable books, but his book Secrecy and Deceit, the religion of the crypto Jews, I think is the full name. It's 700, 800 pages of meticulously researched material, and somewhere I'll look up the page number later, but somewhere he actually specifically talks about this myth of the smotherers, the
okay,
abofadores.
good to know.
But yeah, his book is really worth reading. And the thing about David Gitlitz is that he's very easy to read. So he's an academic, was an academic, a historian, a consummate
Right,
researcher, but he also wrote extremely well. And he doesn't have that opaque style that makes it difficult to read so many good academic studies. And
right.
in Portugal, Jorge Martins
I
has
know,
been, in
George.
fact, he just came out with a brand new book on the hidden Jews of Monsanto, the mountain town
Right.
out toward the border from Belmonte. But I don't know if his books have been translated into English. He's probably
I
the most
don't think so.
reliable. I don't know if you agree with me, Richard, but I would say he's probably the most reliable historian right now
Yeah,
today, writing on the
I
Jews in Portugal.
I gave the initial talk about his book about the Jews of Belmont, which I found very helpful for me because he includes statistics, which I love statistics because, that's my, I don't know why, maybe because I'm a researcher and I like facts and numbers. And he has, statistics about the professions of the Jews, the new Christians in Belmont, and he has lists of names. And so I find that book wonderful for me because it helps me combat these false, conspiracy theories, ideas about how the Portuguese Jews lived. He's been very helpful for me to combat these myths that aren't, at all true.
Yeah, so I think, but I don't think his work has been translated into
No,
any other language that I know of. I mean, I read them in
no,
Portuguese, but hopefully they will be. Some of David Canelo's early stuff in Belmont was translated, but he didn't really
right.
work as a professional historian. I'm trying to think who else. I can't think really of Maria
There's
Antonieta
a
Garcia, but again, her
yeah,
work is just in Portuguese. Um,
yeah. There's very little that has come out in English in my
Yeah, Elvira
experience.
Mayo's work is not translated to my
No,
knowledge. It's a thing about Portugal, like people, I don't know, people don't really know much that comes out of Portugal. They probably know more about you than any other author living in Portugal.
and that's why what sometimes happens is that people assume that Portuguese and Spanish history with regard to the Jews is the same, and they're not. They're different. And so that's another one of my combats is to distinguish Portuguese Jewish history from Spanish Jewish history.
In fact, that was when I first read The Last Kabbalist of Lisbon. That was maybe the most exciting thing. I mean, besides that it's well written and
Right.
it's good to read, and I just reread
Thank you.
it also. But I had read already when that came out all these historical novels about, the Inquisition in Spain, and they all had, which you do not have, fortunately, they all had these classic characters, right? There was the beautiful young Jewish girl and the
Yeah.
handsome young Jewish guy who was going to be a
Yeah.
doctor and the faithful Muslim friend who was also very handsome and saved both the girl and the guy from terrible situations. And almost all the novels that came out sort of in the, I guess, the 1980s, late 70s, 80s, early 90s had this kind of stock
Right.
of characters. And when I picked up The Last Kabbalist of Lisbon, I thought, oh, I hope it's not going to be another one of those. And it wasn't. So not only was it about Portugal, which was completely lacking in this literature. It also
Yeah.
has such a fresh, like the kinds of characters that you might meet, well, a bit bigger than life, but also the kinds of characters that you might meet today,
Yeah,
as
well,
you're
thank you for that. The characters in the book, as I say, came directly out of my research. So that year of research I did about the massacre in Lisbon and what daily life was like, those became the characters. Happily, I avoided reading those terrible novels you referred to.
Jim Otar says, just to add, in the 1600s in Istanbul, which was, of course, Constantinople,
Yeah,
Jews constituted at some point 62% of the licensed doctors. And actually, if you think about it, because the sultans of the Ottoman Empire, among their concubines were Jewish women, according to
right.
Jewish law, some of the sultans, of the Ottoman Empire were Jewish because their mothers were. So just, a little thing
I
that's
see.
been on my mind a couple of times.
Yes,
Any
well,
ads? Uh,
Istanbul became, as far as I know, what I've read, Istanbul became the largest Jewish city in Europe, thanks to the emigration from both Spain and Portugal. I think at one time there was 36 synagogues in Istanbul. So that's a hugely rich, wonderful history.
yeah, in Salonika at some point, Ladino was commonly spoken,
Oh
by
yeah.
Jews. Um,
Like you, Judith, I've spoken to the ancestors, Turkish Jews who speak Ladino. I mean, that was their language until very recently.
Well, it's actually having a big comeback online. One of the things that's happened
Good,
during the pandemic actually is that online classes of Ladino have proliferated.
great.
So Ken Lerner writes that they were just in Portugal, took a walking tour with Paulo Schaefer, who said he's in the middle of writing a book about this history in English. You know him, Paulo Schaefer?
No, I do know some guides and I steer people toward them, but I haven't met Mr. Schaefer.
And I would agree with Cassie. Cassie Wine says she'd like to recommend the novel A Cage Without Bars by Anne Dublin. It's actually very good. It's about, I mean, I added that, it's actually very good. It's about the Portuguese children who were taken from their parents in the Inquisition and sent to the island of São Tomé. And
Yes,
Anne is a very, very good, Anne lives here in Toronto, and she's a
yeah,
very good historical writer for children and young people.
okay,
So she's very careful about her research, and she doesn't make the mistake of thinking that children and young people don't need to have good, solid information.
good,
But she can really write for them. And I actually sang for the launch of that book in Toronto a few years ago.
wonderful.
So yes,
And
Cage
that
Without
reminds
Bars.
me that Mario Claudio, who's a Portuguese novelist, has a book about that tragic episode of the 2,000 children being sent
Mario
to San
Claudio, I'm just
Tome.
writing it in the chat so everyone can see it. And that's
Okay.
Anne Dublin. Is Mario Claudio translated into English?
No, that isn't. Again, you'll have to find that in Portuguese, and I don't know the title, but if you just look up Mario Claudio, if you do speak Portuguese, you'll find the book.
Okay, well, I'll look it up for sure. I'm kind of interested in that. What else do we have? Does anybody else have a question that's not written into the Q&A? Irene points out that only about 3 to 5% of books written in languages other than English are translated into English. Wow, I didn't realize it was that
Yeah,
pathetically
we're
small.
not very good about translating books. In part, I must say, because there's a number of countries, thankfully, that will give support to publishers who translate their authors. So, for instance, Portugal will provide some funding for publishers in Copenhagen or in Stockholm or wherever who will translate Portuguese authors. I don't get that benefit because I don't write my novels in Portuguese, unfortunately.
Ken, who are you talking about? You put KE as an art historian, but I'm not sure if you mean yourself, Ken Lerner, or somebody else. And it's explorer.com is
Okay.
is the link. Again, I don't know anything about that. Um, Ken, you're the one who wrote about Paulo Schaefer. Anybody else have anything to ask or comment on? Oh, he's an artist. He's the art historian, not me. But KE, who is KE? Ken, if you can answer that. I mean, it's really hard to sort out things that are solid from things that are a little bit lacking, shall we say. And there's a lot of romanticization. Certainly as an ethnomusicologist, I spend more than I would like to of my life demythologizing. You know, Ladino is actually a diaspora language, so you wouldn't have heard it in Portugal before the expulsion.
No,
It's a language that developed only in the diaspora. Ladino songs, all the music of Ladino songs is from fairly late in the diaspora, even when the words are older, even when some of the words are older.
right.
Most of the songs that people hear are not even those with the older words. They're from, you know, late 19th century, uh, Constantinople, Smyrna, Salonika, and so on. So, I mean, there's all this, and it's very hard to kind of separate out in history and ethnography and music. It's very hard to, in genealogy, as you were saying, Richard, uh, it's very hard to separate it out. And it isn't that no Jews took names of plants. You mean in German and Ashkenazi Jews, you have Rosenfeld, you know,
Yeah,
also, for example. The singer Esther Lamandier, it turns out that her name was actually Mandelbaum, which is literally
yeah,
Lamandier, the almond tree.
right.
But it's just that it's not a given. So, you know, I always think of it, if you want to disguise yourself as Christian and you move to England and you're Jewish and you say, well, what's a good, ordinary, boring name? I know, Johnson. I'll call myself Johnson.
Right.
The, you can't say, therefore, all Johnsons are really Jewish. So that's the logical flaw.
Right. You know, people come up to me all the time and say, how can I, you know, I have Pareda in my in my family. Pareda is pear tree, or Oliveira, which is olive tree. I must be Jewish. You know, how do I research that? And you know, I have to tell them, because I think honesty is the way forward. You know, that name in itself means nothing. You really have to do some genealogical studies. I don't know how you do that. If they went to, you know, if they went to Bordeaux, if they went to London, if they went to Hamburg, if they were part of a synagogue, you can maybe find out information about births and marriages and names in the family. But you're going to have to do research, because just having a last name doesn't mean anything.
Right. Rochelle Bortnick, who is, of course, the, I don't know what to call her, the diva and the grandmother of, you know, late 20th century on, including right to this minute, Ladino studies. She writes, thanks for this interesting lecture. There's quite a bit about Jews of Portugal. This is really true, good, great reference. In Miriam Bodian's Hebrews of the Portuguese Nation. So it's centered on Amsterdam and the history of the Portuguese Jews of Amsterdam, but the
Yeah.
background to it has a lot of really solid information. And Miriam has written other things since that book that are equally good and equally solid.
Yeah.
So yes, if you're looking for, you know, even though it's centered on Amsterdam, the background is,
Right.
you know,
Yeah, there's another book called Rembrandt's Jews that I've read. And so, you know, Rembrandt happened to end up living in, you know, the big Jewish, I want to call it neighborhood or quarter. And so he had a lot of Jewish acquaintances and friends and business, you know, not partners, but people whom he dealt with. And that's, you know, most of them were Portuguese as well.
Sharon writes, almost every city has a Jewish genealogical society, but there also are online Jewish genealogical societies.
Yeah.
What you should not do, following up on what Richard correctly said, what you should not do is go to a thing on that you can find online saying a list of Sephardic surnames and
Yeah.
go, see, my name's there. No, that's a myth also. I mean, my name is Cohen, and, you know, way back when, I'm sure, you know, my late father was descended from Aaron HaKohen, but we're Ashkenazi Jews. And so people say, oh, you're a Cohen, you must be Sephardic. So that's just another example of this kind of mythology. So we are 20 after 1. We've been having a great time here. So unless there are any other pressing questions, but again, people are welcome to contact me or to contact Richard. I'm sure there are many other questions that will come up. Richard, is there any last thing you wanted to leave us with?
You know, I just want to mention one thing. I said I was in Castelo Branco, and I wrote down something about two of the victims of the Inquisition there, because it just upset me so much. And And that's one of the reasons I write these books, as I was saying, because I get upset and I feel like I need to somehow correct an injustice. And the two names I read, one was Antonio do Espírito Santo, and Antonia was arrested by the Inquisition when she was 14 years old. And she died in prison 2 years later. So she was kept in the prison and died there, 14 years old. And the second one was Maria Gomes. Maria was arrested according to the process of the Inquisition, the records of the Inquisition, when she was 115 years old. Now, maybe she wasn't really 115 years old. The birth records weren't so specific back then. Maybe she was only 95 or 100. It doesn't matter. She was arrested as this very, very old woman and burnt alive in an act of faith. Now, if that doesn't make you angry, these two cases, I really don't know what could get your blood boiling. And so when I write these novels, it's in part to speak for Antonia and for Maria, who lost the chance to speak for themselves.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. And I think I would tend to leave it at that and think about that and think about what you've done for that reason and what all of us can do in our own ways, even if we can't be the kind of writer that we all wish we were and that you are. So thank you so much. Thanks to the Israel and Julia Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies at York University for hosting this. Thanks to the silent Julie Feinberg, who set this all up and took care of all the technology and everything else. And
I forgot to thank Julie. So thank you, Julie. Thank you.
Without Julie at the center, we would be totally lost. And thanks to David Kaufman for the wonderful introduction that he took care to tape last week, knowing that he would be busy. Thank you, Richard, for giving us such a thoughtful, tailored to this occasion introduction to your work. And thanks to all of you who asked questions, made comments, and again, feel free to keep in touch. Let me just see if I've missed anything. I think we're okay. Great. So until the next time.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Judith.